Those were good days.
You had access to more medication.
Before politics and viral clips turned late-night television into a battlefield. There was one man who reigned with quiet authority and irresistible charm. Johnny Carson. For 3 decades, he didn't just host a talk show. He shaped the very rhythm of American evenings. Every night, millions gathered in their living rooms, parents and children alike, to share laughter that felt effortless, unforced, and timeless. Carson's gift was not only in his timing or his wit, but in the way he became the perfect mirror for whoever sat beside him. When a guest was sharp, he leaned into the banter. When a guest was chaotic, he allowed himself to dissolve into giggles. And on rare occasions, when the right spark ignited, Johnny Carson ceased being the polished MC and transformed into one more member of the audience, wiping away tears, pounding the desk, unable to hide his joy. Those moments are the heartbeat of The Tonight Show. They are the memories etched into cultural history, recalled by fans who still describe sneaking out of bed just to catch a glimpse of the magic. But here's what many forget. The greatest eruptions of laughter came from a handful of guests who had the power to dismantle Carson's cool exterior. Not everyone could do it. Only a select few cracked the armor of the king of late night. Some names are familiar, but their stories are deeper than the myths suggest. Rodney Dangerfield, with his finely tuned one-liners, could make Carson laugh until he cried. Dean Martin blurred the line between performance and reality, leaving audiences wondering if the martini in his hand was real. Buddy Hackett spun tall tales so absurd they stretched a simple hunting trip into a full-blown epic. Jonathan Winters, master of improvisation, turned broken props into entire universes. Robin Williams carried that torch forward, a storm of energy too wild to contain. And Steve Martin, clever, absurd, daring, proved that even the structure of a talk show could be a setup for a punchline. And those were only the headliners. Fans still insist that Don Rickles, Jackie Mason, Bob Uecker, and Carol Wayne deserve their place in the pantheon of Carson's most beloved. Their appearances weren't just guest spots. They were family moments that revealed a side of Johnny no script could manufacture. So let's revisit those unforgettable nights. Let's explore the stories, the secrets, and the surprises behind the guests who truly made Johnny Carson laugh, and, in doing so, helped define an era of television that may never return. Rodney Dangerfield. When it came to the art of stand-up, few people could disarm Johnny Carson quite like Rodney Dangerfield. The man in the slightly rumpled suit, with eyes that darted nervously and a tie that never seemed to sit quite right, carried an arsenal of jokes so sharp they could detonate an audience within seconds. He called it his no-respect act, but on Carson's stage, Rodney earned something rarer, genuine awe. His entrances were always understated. He would shuffle onto the set, tugging at his collar as though the studio lights were too hot, and within moments he'd unleash a cascade of self-deprecating lines. "I tell ya, I get no respect," became more than a catchphrase. It was a rhythm, a promise that every punchline would land harder than the last. The crowd erupted in laughter, but Carson's reaction was different. He wasn't just amused, he was undone. One legendary night in the early 1980s, Rodney's timing reached surgical precision. Every pause, every sigh, every frantic tug at his tie served as fuel for the next explosion of laughter. The audience howled, and Carson tried to keep his composure. But by the time Rodney delivered the line about his own mother treating him like just a friend, Johnny collapsed into helpless laughter. His head fell to the desk, tears streaked his face, and when it was time to cut to commercial, he literally couldn't form the words. What most viewers never knew is how seriously Carson studied that craft. During breaks, he would quietly pull Rodney aside and ask about the mechanics. How long should the pause last? How much should a comedian lean on repetition before moving on? For Johnny, who saw hundreds of comics pass across his stage, that kind of curiosity was rare. Rodney wasn't just entertaining him, he was teaching him. And the respect flowed both ways. Rodney often said that appearing on Carson's Tonight Show was a kind of validation no award could equal. The laughter of millions was one thing, but seeing Johnny Carson himself doubled over, gasping for breath, was the true badge of honor. On that night, the man who built an act around having no respect walked away with all of it. Dean Martin. If Rodney Dangerfield conquered Carson with sheer precision, Dean Martin charmed him by appearing as if he hadn't prepared at all. Dean would stroll onto the Tonight Show set with that famous half-smile, a glass in hand, and the air of someone who might have accidentally wandered into the studio. To audiences at home, it felt spontaneous, unpredictable, even reckless. But to Carson, it was artistry in disguise. Dean's reputation as the lovable drunk became part of television lore. Viewers debated endlessly. Was he truly tipsy, or was it all part of the act? The truth leaned toward performance. Every slurred name, every casual quip, every grin at the wrong moment was choreographed with a skill only the seasoned could pull off. Dean made it look easy, and that was the genius. One appearance in the mid-1970s sealed the legend. Sitting across from Carson, Dean pretended to forget the very movie he was supposed to promote. He fumbled the title, greeted the audience like unexpected guests in his living room, and dropped one-liners that felt as if they had slipped out by accident. "How did all these people get in your room?" he asked Johnny, as though the Tonight Show crowd had simply wandered in from the street. Carson erupted. He wasn't watching a performance. He was caught in the illusion of chaos. Behind the curtain, Johnny admired this more than anyone realized. He knew the difference between genuine sloppiness and a master making it look effortless. For Carson, who had to keep a show moving with clockwork timing, Dean's looseness was liberating. It reminded him that the best comedy often came when the audience believed they were witnessing something raw, unfiltered. More than once, Johnny would slip into Dean's dressing room before tapings, not to discuss setups or punchlines, but simply to absorb that calm energy. "When you're comfortable with yourself," Carson later remarked, "the audience relaxes too." And nobody embodied that principle better than Dean Martin. For viewers, these moments were a window into a rare kind of cool, one that didn't demand the laugh, but invited it. For Carson, Dean was a reminder that sometimes the greatest act is to act as if there was no act at all. Buddy Hackett, where Dean Martin floated through the Tonight Show like a breeze, Buddy Hackett arrived like a thunderclap, stocky, animated, with a voice that seemed to ricochet around the studio. Buddy didn't just tell jokes, he built worlds. His comedy was less about punchlines and more about the journey. Sprawling stories filled with absurd detours, bizarre characters, and unexpected payoffs. And Carson adored him for it. The beauty of Buddy's style was unpredictability. He could start with something as simple as a hunting story and, within minutes, the audience found themselves in a surreal showdown involving barns, farmers, and the strangest rules of country justice. By the time the punchline arrived, no one had any idea how they'd gotten there, but everyone was breathless with laughter. Carson included. One night, Buddy delivered his now legendary duck tale. What began as a straightforward anecdote about shooting a duck spiraled into a wild negotiation with a farmer who proposed the most ridiculous way to settle ownership. The audience howled, "Carson!" Normally the picture of composure doubled over, his laughter breaking through like waves. He slapped the desk, shook his head, and for a moment, The Tonight Show was less a talk show and more a carnival ride Buddy controlled completely. Of course, with Buddy came rumors. Some fans insisted he was eventually banned from the program for crossing the line with material that was too risque for network television. The reality was less dramatic. Buddy's humor could indeed stray into racy territory. But Carson never truly exiled him. In fact, they remained close friends. And Buddy returned to the show multiple times. The ban became more myth than fact, another layer that added to his unpredictable image. Behind the scenes, Carson admired Buddy's fearlessness. Hosting required structure, segments, commercials, timing to the second. Buddy blew through those boundaries, and Johnny respected the audacity. He knew the chaos was deliberate, guided by instincts honed over decades on stage. For viewers, Hackett's appearances were unforgettable because they felt unplanned, alive, and untamed. For Carson, they were lessons in how far comedy could stretch without snapping. Buddy Hackett didn't just make Johnny laugh. He reminded him that sometimes the funniest moments are the ones no one sees coming. Jonathan Winters. If Buddy Hackett was a storm, Jonathan Winters was a universe unto himself. He didn't need polished setups or scripted jokes. All he required was a spark. Hand Jonathan a broken umbrella, a random hat, even an empty glass. And suddenly The Tonight Show became a stage for a dozen characters no one had seen before. His imagination was infinite, and Carson recognized it instantly. One unforgettable night in the early 1980s, Johnny casually passed Jonathan a bent umbrella, almost as a throwaway gag. Within seconds, Winters transformed into a half-mad British colonel stranded in a rainstorm, spinning outrageous military anecdotes that grew stranger with each sentence. At one point, he claimed that a soldier had been devoured by his own canteen, and Carson simply collapsed, his head tilted back, tears streaming, his laughter rolling out of him in uncontrollable bursts. What made Winters so special wasn't just the comedy itself. It was the sense that no one, not even he, knew what was coming next. Carson, who valued control and timing as a host, cherished Jonathan because he represented the opposite, freedom without a net. In fact, Johnny often instructed his crew to extend the segment whenever Winters appeared. Scheduled breaks could wait. The magic couldn't. The connection went even deeper. Jonathan Winters became a guiding star for a younger generation of improvisers, most famously Robin Williams. Williams often said Winters showed him that comedy could be fearless, that a performer could leap headfirst into the unknown and trust the audience to follow. For Carson, watching Winters perform was like witnessing the birth of a new language in real time. Off camera, Johnny admired Jonathan's resilience as well. Winters had struggled with personal battles, including mental health challenges. Yet when the cameras rolled, he transformed that turbulence into art. Carson respected the courage it took to not only survive, but to create beauty from chaos. For the audience, Winters was a revelation, a reminder that comedy didn't always have to follow rules or rely on the expected. For Carson, he was more than a guest. He was proof that imagination itself could steal the show. Robin Williams. If Jonathan Winters was a painter of wild, surreal landscapes, then Robin Williams was the fireworks exploding above them. By the early 1980s, Robin had already captured audiences with his alien character on Mork and Mindy, but on Carson's stage, he showed just how uncontainable his energy really was. To watch him was to watch comedy at the speed of thought. The moment he walked through the curtain, the Tonight Show crew braced themselves. Extra microphones were clipped in place. Cameras stood ready to follow him. And the band prepared for the possibility that Robin might suddenly decide to conduct them. He didn't just sit in a chair. He occupied every inch of the studio, shifting voices, characters, and accents as if his mind were a carousel spinning too fast for the rest of the world to catch up. One legendary appearance began calmly enough. Within seconds, Robin had shifted from his Mork persona to a fiery Southern preacher. Then, without warning, slipped into the pirouettes of a Russian ballet dancer. Sometimes he combined them all, delivering a sermon mid-spin, robes imagined, sweat flying. The crowd roared. Carson, who had seen nearly everything in show business, was reduced to a gasping spectator, pounding his desk with laughter as Robin clipped his coffee mug mid-gesture and sent it tumbling. What Carson valued most wasn't just the sheer speed of Robin's improvisation, but his bravery. Johnny often remarked that Robin was the rare comic who would rather risk disaster than play it safe. Each bit felt like a high-wire act without a net, and that fearlessness made Carson respect him deeply. In Robin, Johnny saw the living proof of Winters' influence, the torch of unrestrained imagination passed on and burning even brighter. Offstage, Robin's humility endeared him to Carson even more. He often credited Winters as a mentor, never pretending his genius was born in isolation. That lineage, one comic inspiring another, was exactly what kept late-night television alive with new energy. For viewers, Robin Williams' Tonight Show appearances felt electric, unpredictable, and unforgettable. For Carson, they were a reminder that comedy could still surprise him, that even after decades in the chair, someone could light up the studio in a way no rehearsal could ever capture. Steve Martin. By the late 1970s, Johnny Carson had seen it all. From polished monologues to unpredictable chaos, nothing seemed capable of surprising him anymore. That changed with Steve Martin. He didn't storm the stage with high voltage like Robin Williams, nor did he weave endless tales like Buddy Hackett. Instead, Steve approached comedy with a kind of clever mischief, a willingness to turn the very structure of The Tonight Show into a setup for the punchline. At first glance, Steve looked like the model of clean-cut professionalism, white suit, banjo at times, his wry grin hovering between sincerity and satire. But beneath that exterior was a comedian determined to play with expectations. His appearances on Carson's show were less interviews and more experiments. Could he dismantle the talk show format in real time and make the host himself part of the joke? The answer was yes. One of his most famous visits delivered exactly that. Mid-conversation. Without warning, Steve suddenly announced, "I have to leave." He stood up, straightened his suit, and walked off the stage, leaving Carson blinking in confusion as the audience gasped and chuckled. For several moments, Johnny sat alone at his desk, unsure whether to cut to commercial or wait. Then, as casually as he had exited, Steve returned, slid back into his chair, and continued the interview as if nothing had happened. The studio erupted. Carson's laughter was genuine and tinged with admiration. Here was a comic bold enough to risk awkward silence on national television, yet skilled enough to make it hilarious. Off camera, Johnny praised him for the stunt, calling it either completely insane or completely brilliant. In truth, it was both. What Carson respected most about Steve Martin was his innovation. He reminded Johnny that even a format as established as late-night television could still surprise, still evolve. Steve's mixture of absurdity, intellect, and boldness forced The Tonight Show to be more than just a talk show. It became performance art. For viewers, those appearances were refreshing, even daring. For Carson, Steve Martin represented the possibility that comedy could always reinvent itself, and that even after decades of laughter, there were still new ways to make the king of late night lose his composure. The fan favorites and unsung guests, as unforgettable as Carson's Big Six were, the story would be incomplete without the names fans still bring up with affection. They weren't always the headliners, but their appearances shaped the fabric of The Tonight Show just as deeply, and Johnny knew it. At the top of that list was Don Rickles, the razor-tongued master of insult comedy. Whenever Rickles sat beside Carson, the room became a battlefield of barbs and affection. He could roast Johnny so mercilessly that the host doubled over, only to embrace him warmly moments later. That balance of sting and sincerity kept audiences howling, and Johnny cherished every minute of it. Then there was Jackie Mason, whose quick, biting delivery brought a distinctly New York rhythm to The Tonight Show couch. His legendary routines, often poking fun at culture and class, once had Carson nearly sliding out of his chair with laughter. Mason's wit was sharp, but his timing made it universal. Bob Uecker, known to millions as Mr. Baseball, transformed sports commentary into pure theater. He spun stories of dugouts and games that veered into absurdity, making even non-fans laugh as though they'd been lifelong devotees of the sport. Carson valued Bob because he proved that comedy could spring from anywhere, even the ballpark. And of course, Carol Wayne, the matinee lady from Carson's recurring tea time sketches. With her playful innocence and comic timing, she brought warmth and levity to Johnny's straight man act. Their chemistry became a signature part of the show's identity, a reminder that not all legendary moments came from stand-up giants. Sometimes they came from recurring characters audiences grew to love like family. These four, alongside the famous six, represent more than laughter. They embody the spirit of Carson's Tonight Show, a place where comedy in all its forms, sharp, absurd, charming, or flirtatious, could thrive. For Johnny, they weren't just guests. They were co-authors of a golden era, one that remains etched in television history. When the final curtain fell on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show in 1992, it wasn't just the end of a television program. It was the closing of an era. For 30 years, Carson's desk had been more than a piece of furniture. It was a portal into American life. Around it, legends were born, myths were created, and laughter became a kind of nightly ritual shared across generations. Looking back, what stands out is not only Carson's impeccable skill as a host, but also the rare gift of those who managed to break through his polished exterior. Rodney Dangerfield with his relentless punchlines, Dean Martin with his effortless cool, Buddy Hackett's chaotic storytelling, Jonathan Winters's boundless imagination, Robin Williams's fearless frenzy, and Steve Martin's daring subversions. All of them stripped away the curtain of performance and left Johnny laughing like the rest of us. The supporting cast mattered just as much. Don Rickles' fiery roasts, Jackie Mason's biting wit, Bob Euchre's whimsical sports tales, and Carol Wayne's charming sketches together. They added color, texture, and warmth. They reminded viewers that The Tonight Show was not only about famous names, but about personalities who became part of the family. For the audience, these nights were not just entertainment. They were memory-making. Parents sat with children, laughter spilling into living rooms. Teenagers stayed up past curfew to hear jokes they'd retell at school the next day. In an age before the internet, these moments went viral the old-fashioned way, repeated in offices, kitchens, and playgrounds until they became part of the cultural fabric. Carson himself once said that his job was simply to be there when it happened. And perhaps that's the greatest reflection of his legacy. He didn't force the laughs or dominate the spotlight. Instead, he created a space where the funniest minds could shine. And in doing so, he allowed himself to be surprised, right alongside us. Today, when clips resurface online, they feel less like dusty relics and more like time capsules, reminders of a world where comedy didn't need to be cruel, political, or overproduced to connect. It just needed authenticity and a host who knew when to step aside and let the magic unfold. Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was never just television. It was a nightly gathering, a shared heartbeat of laughter, and its echo remains alive in every smile it still inspires.